For ISO 14001, the organization should identify an external and internal matter which may be relevant to the mission and may cause an impression on its ability to realize the goals of EMS. And for ISO 5001, the organization must identify the significant external and internal challenges to its goal because it has an impression on its capacity. And for ISO 9001, the organization must identify the external and internal difficulties that are relevant to its mission. For ISO 14001, the organization must determine the applicable wishes and expectancies of the vaccinated parties which might be necessary. And for ISO 5001, the organization should determine other involved events who are applicable to Occupational Health and Safety Management System (OHSMS) and the workplace wishes and expectancy additionally as the ones or different involved events. And for ISO 9001, due to capability effects at the company's potential, business enterprise shall, which is interested event who have stake in the QMS, which can be essential to the QMS. For ISO 14001, it will determine the environmental control system scope and its compliance responsibility supported associated degree awareness of interested parties' desires. And for ISO 45001, it will determine the occupational health and safety management system scope and external and internal demanding situation related to expertise the enterprise. And for ISO 9001, it will determine the scope of the same old control system, which is the organization, merchandise, and services. For ISO 14001, when constructing and preserving an environmental control system, the employer ought to take below attention to expertise received while reading the employer or its setting. And for ISO 45001, in line with desires of the document, the business enterprise shall establish, implement, maintain, and decree an occupational health and safety management system. And for ISO 9001, it will identify the QMS processes that are required, which included the desired effects and anticipated consequences from those strategies, and it will assign roles and duty for those strategies.
Next, for the class 5, which is leadership. For the class 5.1, leadership and commitment, for the ISO 40001, it takes accountability for the effectiveness of the environmental management system. It also ensuring the environmental policy and objective established and compatible. The resources needed for the environmental management system are available. For the ISO 9001, for the class 5.1.1 general, it takes accountability for the effectiveness of the quality management system. It is also ensuring the quality policy objective are established and compatible, and the resources needed for the quality management system are available. For the class 5.1.2, customer focus, the focus on enhancing customer satisfaction is maintained. For the ISO 45001, it takes overall responsibility for prevention of the work-related injury and ill health. It also ensuring the OH&S policy and objective are established and compatible. The resources needed to establish, implement, maintain, and improve the OH&S management system are available. For the next class, which is 5.2 policy, all of these ISO have the same point, which is to establish, implement, and maintain by provide framework for each of the objective. For the ISO 40001, is including a commitment to the protection of the environmental, including prevention of the pollution. For the ISO 9001, is including a commitment to certify applicable requirement. For the ISO 45001 is to including a commitment to provide safe and health working condition for the prevention of the work-related injury and ill health. For the class in the ISO 40009, we have the class of 5.2.2 communicated the quality policy, which is to be available and be maintained as the documented information and be communicated, understood, and applied within the organization. Next, for the class 5.3, organization, responsibility, and authorities, for the ISO 40001 and ISO 9001, both of these ISO have conformed to the requirement of this international standard, while for the ISO 45001 has ensuring that the OH&S management system conform to the requirement of this document. All of these three ISO have report on the performance to the top management. Lastly, for the class 5.4 consultation and participation of the workers, we can only see in the ISO 45001, which is to provide machine, time, training, and resources necessary for the consultation, and also to provide timely access to clear, understandable, and relevant information about the OH&S management system, and also to remove obstacle or variant for the participation.
Today, I would like to share with you about the comparison in ISO 14001, ISO 45001, and ISO 19001 based on Clause 6. Clause 6.1 Actions to address risk and opportunity. For ISO 14001, general organization need to establish, implement, and maintain process need to meet the requirement in general. The organization should consider this aspect when planning EMS, issue about external and internal of EMS, need and expectation of third parties, address the scope of EMS to give assurance EMS can achieve its extended outcome. For ISO 45001, general organizer should consider the issue of external and internal of OH&S management system. Next, determine the risks and opportunities that need to be give assurance the OH&S management system achieve, undesirable effect reduced or prevented, conformal improvement achieved. For ISO 19001, general organization shall consider the issue of external and internal of EMS. Other than that, the risk and opportunity that need to be determined, give assurance the quality management system achieve, desirable effects enhance, reduce and prevent the undesirable effects and achieve improvement. For ISO 14001, environment aspect, organization need to determine the environment aspect of activities, product and service. Compliance obligation, determining access and how the compliance obligation apply to organization. Planning action, organization should plan significant environment aspect and risk all the opportunities. On ISO 45001, hazard identification. Process for hazard identification need to be established, implement and maintain. Determination about legal requirement. Lastly, planning action. Organization required to plan, address the risks and opportunities other for respond to emergency situation. On ISO 19001, the risks and opportunities need to be addressed and planned. Now, for Clause 6.2 is about objective and planning to achieve. First, in ISO 14001, environment objective. Organization need establish environment objective at relevant function and level, taking into account the organization's significant environmental aspect and associated compliance obligation. For ISO 45001, organization need to establish OS and H same as in the ISO 14001. Both of ISO 14001 and ISO 45001, the OS and H objective and environment objective need to be consistent, be measurable or capable of performance evaluation, be monitored, be communicated and updated as appropriated. Move to ISO 19001, organization need to establish like the others. Quality objective need to be consistent with quality policy, measurable, take into account applicable requirement, relevant to conformity of product and service, monitored, be complicated and be updated. When planning action or the quality in all of the ISO involved, the organization need to determine what will be done, what resource will require, who will be responsible, when it will completed and how the result will be evaluated. Lastly, for ISO 19001 in planning changes, the change shall be carried out in planned manner. The organization need to consider the purpose of changes and potential of consequence, the integrity of quality management system, availability of resource, and allocation or reallocation of responsibilities and authorities.
So I will continue on clause 7. In clause 7 consists of 5 subclauses. First one is resources. In generally, the organization shall determine and provide the resources needed for the establishment, implementation, maintenance, and continual improvement. But in ISO 40001, it focuses on environmental management systems. In ISO 9001, it focuses on quality management system, and for the ISO 40001, it focuses on the OSH management system. Next, 7.2, which is competence. The differences that we found from these three standards is for the ISO 40001, competence person that affects environmental performance and ability to fulfill compliance obligation. For the ISO 9001, competence person that affects the performance and effectiveness of quality management system, and for the ISO 40001, competence of workers that affects or mainly affects its OSH performance. Also, from these three standards for the ISO 40001 and 9001, the organization shall ensure these persons are competent with education, training, and experience. While in ISO 40001, The organization shall ensure workers are competent with education, training, or experience, including ability to identify the hazard. For the 7.3, which is awareness for the ISO 40001 and ISO 90001, the organization shall ensure that the persons doing work under the organization's control by in ISO 40001, they are aware of environmental policy and the significant environmental aspect. In ISO 9001, they need aware of the quality policy and relevant quality objective, while in ISO 45001, the worker shall be made aware of the OSH policy and OSH objective. 7.4, which is communication. In generally ISO 40001, the organization need to implement and maintain processes needed for internal and external communication relevant to environmental management system, which include what, when, with whom, and how. For the ISO 9001, the organization need to determine internal and external communication relevant to quality management system, which include what, when, with whom, how, and who. For the ISO 45001, the organization need to implement and maintain process needed in internal and external communication relevant to OSH management system, which include what, when, with whom, and how. Next, in ISO 40001, when establishing its communication process, the organization shall take into account compliant obligation during communication processes. While in ISO 45001, the organization need to take into account legal requirements and other requirements during communication processes. Other than that, in ISO 40001, the organization need to ensure the environmental information communicated is consistent with information generated with EMS and reliable. In ISO 45001, the organization shall ensure OSH information communicated is consistent with information generated within OSH management system and reliable. Lastly, 7.5, which is documented information. In generally these three standards, the organization's management system shall include the documented information required by this information standard and documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the environmental management system. Other than that, the difference that we found from these three standards in ISO 40001, the documented information is needed to demonstrate fulfillment of compliant obligations, while ISO 45001, the documented information is needed to demonstrate fulfillment of legal requirements and other requirements.
So now I am going to explain class 8, which is 8.1, Operation, Planning and Control. For ISO 40001 and ISO 45001, it is the requirement of environmental management system to carry out the action, and the implementation action determined in clause 6. While for ISO 90001 is the to satisfy the requirement for product and services offering as well as to carry out the activities. But for ISO 45001, it is divided by subclasses, 3 subclasses, which is eliminating hazard and reducing OHS risk using the hierarchy of control. The second one, management of change for temporary and permanent changes that impact OHS performance. Last one, procurement, to control the procurement of product and services in order to ensure their conformity and to identify the hazard. Next, for 8.2, requirement for products and services for ISO 9001, but for ISO 40001 and ISO 45001 is emergency preparedness and response. For emergency preparedness and response for ISO 40001 is by planning action to prevent the environmental impact, respond to actual emergency situation, and take action to prevent the consequences of emergency situation. While for ISO 45001 is to establishing planned response to emergency situation, provide training for the planned response, and testing, exercising the planned response capability. But for ISO 90001 is the requirement for product and services is for customer communication, determine the requirement of the product and services, review of the requirement for product, and the organization shall retain documented information. It has 8.3 is the design and development of product and services. 8.4 control of externally provided processes, product and services. 8.5 production and service prevision. 8.6 release of products and services, and 8.7 is control of non-conforming outputs.
Present about the class 9, which is 9.1 is monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation. 9.2 is internal audit, and 9.3 is management review. Okay, for the class 9.1, monitoring, measurement, analysis and evaluation, it shows the comparison between the three ISO, which is ISO 14001, ISO 19001, and 45001. It shows the what shall the organization do, which is from the monitor, measure, analyze and evaluate its environmental performance, and what the organization shall determine is the comparison between the three ISO. This is the continuous from the evaluation. And then we see here the 9.1 and 0.2 evaluation of compliance. It shows the ISO 40001 and ISO 45001. It quite similar, and it difference from the ISO 19001. For the subclass 9.2, which is the internal audit, we can see here the internal audit between for the three ISO is quite similar, but for the ISO 14001 and 9001, it more to the environmental management system, and for 45001, it's more to the OH and S management system. For the 9.2.2 internal audit program, it's more to the differences. We can see the differences between the three ISO. For class 9.3, which is the management review, for the 9.3.1, the general, we can see here for ISO 4001 and ISO 9001, the environmental quality management system, it is quite similar, and the difference between the 45001, we can see there the is reviewed to the OH and S management system. Okay, for 9.3.2 for the inputs, we can see here the differences between the consideration between three ISO 40001, ISO 9001 and 45001. For 9.3.3 outputs, it also shows the differences between three ISO, which is the ISO 4001, 9001 and 45001. These the differences.
10.1 General, ISO 40001, the organization shall determine opportunity for improvement to achieve intended outcome of EMS. ISO 90001, the organization shall determine and select opportunities to meet customer requirement. ISO 45001, the organization shall determine opportunities for improvement to achieve intended outcome of OH&S management system. 10.2 Non-conformity and corrective action. 10.2.1 for ISO 40001 and ISO 90001, they have a few same point, except for ISO 40001, make changes to EMF is needed. For ISO 90001, update risk opportunity is necessary and make changes to quality management system if necessary. For ISO 45001, react in timely manner to the incident of non-conformity, evaluate the participation, review existing assessment, determine implement action needed, assess OH&S risk, make changes to OH&S management system. For 10.2.2, for ISO 40001 and ISO 90001, they have the same point. For the organization shall retain documented information as evidence, the nature of the non-conformity and the result of any corrective action. For ISO 45001, the nature of incident or non-conformity and any subsequent action taken, result of any action, corrective action, including their effectiveness. 10.3 Continual improvement. For ISO 14001, the organization shall continually improve suitability, effectiveness of EMS to enhance environmental performance. For ISO 90001, continually improve the suitability adequacy of the quality management system. For ISO 45001, continually improve the suitability adequacy effectiveness of OH&S management system by enhance OH&S performance, promoting cultural support, promoting participation of workers, communicating the relevant result of continual improvement, maintaining and retaining documented information of continual improvement.